April 15th, 1945. The war in Germany was collapsing like a dying animal. Spasms of gunfire, fading roars of artillery, and then, suddenly, silence. Inside a damp cellar on the edge of a bombed-out German town, Greta Muller froze. The silence scared her more than the bombs ever had. For 3 days, the ground had trembled so hard that dust rained down from the ceiling. The sound of explosions had been so constant that her youngest, 5-year-old Maria, had stopped reacting to them altogether. But now, there was nothing. Not a single blast, not even a shout from the streets above. Just stillness, the kind that makes your skin crawl. Greta sat on the cold floor, her back against a wall that had long since lost its paint. She pulled her children close. Hans, 8 years old and thin as a scarecrow, lay in her lap, his ribs pressed against her arm with every shallow breath. His hair, once the color of wheat, had grown dull and matted. Maria slept curled beside them, her tiny hands clutching a ragged doll missing an eye. They had been hiding here for 3 months, living off turnip soup and moldy bread crusts. The air was thick with mildew and fear. Somewhere above them, the town that had once been their home was now rubble. Greta didn't know which army controlled it anymore, and at this point, she didn't care. She only cared that her children were still breathing. "Mama," Hans whispered, voice cracking from thirst. "Are they gone?" Greta brushed the hair from his forehead. "Shh," she murmured. "Don't talk. Save your strength." Her words were automatic, like breathing, survival phrases that had replaced bedtime stories. She had used them every day since January, when a letter came from the front saying her husband, Johann, was dead. They said he'd been shot trying to desert the army during the retreat from the Russians. The night that letter arrived, Greta had gone into the back room, found her Nazi Party membership card, and fed it to the stove fire. She'd watched the little flame eat away at the eagle, the swastika, and every lie she'd ever believed. Now, months later, she was just another widow trying to keep her children alive as her country disintegrated around her. A low rumble broke the quiet, faint, distant, rhythmic. Not bombs this time, engine. Greta froze. She crawled toward the small basement window, the one half covered by sandbags and grime. Carefully, she brushed the dust away and peered through the slit. Outside, the street was a graveyard. A burnt wagon sat sideways across the cobblestones. Broken glass glittered in the sunlight. A cat picked its way through the wreckage, its fur blackened with soot. Every building on the block had been shelled or burned, their facades hollowed out like skull. And then, movement. The first Jeep rolled into view, olive green, dented, streaked with dried mud. 2 soldiers sat inside, helmets tipped back, cigarettes between their lips. They looked impossibly calm, almost bored. Another Jeep followed behind it, then a truck, its canvas top flapping in the breeze. The white star painted on the doors confirmed what she already suspected. The Americans were here. Her heart slammed against her ribs. For months, the radio had screamed warnings about these men, that they were devils who would murder German families, that they would do unspeakable things to women and children. Every propaganda poster she'd seen in town had shown them as grotesque creatures with claws and fangs, blood dripping from their hands. But through the cracked window, these men looked normal, young, tired. One of them was laughing at something another said. Another stirred something over a small fire near the curb, a smell drifting up that made Greta's stomach clench. It was food, rich, savory, smoky food. Not the watery soup she'd been making out of turnips and hope. This was real food. Meat, maybe beans. Whatever it was enough to make her mouth water and her stomach twist painfully. Hans stirred beside her. "Mama," he whispered, "I smell food." She swallowed hard. "Stay quiet. Don't move." But she could already see the wild hope lighting in his hollow eyes. Hunger had worn down his fear. "We stay hidden," Greta said again, firmer this time. "Do you understand? Stay hidden." But hunger speaks louder than fear. Before she could stop him, Hans was already on his feet. The cellar door creaked. "Hans!" she hissed. "Hans, come back!" He didn't look back. He just pushed open the heavy wooden door and disappeared into the daylight. Greta's body went numb. For a moment she couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then, forcing herself up, she stumbled toward the window, pressing her face to the dirty glass. Outside, her son stood blinking in the harsh sunlight, swaying slightly. He looked like a ghost of a child, his clothes hanging loose on his fragile frame. About 50 meters away, 3 American soldiers sat by their fire, eating from metal tins. One of them noticed Hans first, a dark-haired soldier, young, maybe 25, his rifle slung lazily over his shoulder. He said something to his friends and stood up slowly, careful not to startle the boy. Greta's heart stopped. This was it, the moment the propaganda had promised. But the soldier didn't lift his weapon. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled something out, a brown rectangle wrapped in silver foil, a chocolate bar. He crouched down a little, held it out, and said something in English. His tone wasn't angry. It was soft, gentle even. Hans froze, his body shaking. Greta could see him trembling from where she stood. The soldier took a slow step closer, then another. Hans hesitated, his eyes darting between the man and the chocolate. His hand paused, and then reached out. When their hands met, the boy snatched the bar and stepped back. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Hans tore the wrapper open, broke off a piece and shoved it into his mouth. His eyes closed, Greta's vision blurred with tears. The American smiled faintly, said something she couldn't hear, and nodded toward the cellar, a silent invitation for her to come out. Every instinct screamed at her to stay hidden. Every survival reflex told her this was a trick. But the sound of her son's chewing, that small, hungry, human sound, pulled her forward. Slowly, trembling, Greta climbed the stairs. The daylight hit her like a slap. Her eyes watered as she stepped into the open for the first time in weeks. The soldier turned at the sound. He didn't raise his gun. He just looked at her, really looked at her. And for a strange, dizzying second, she saw not an enemy, but another tired soul who'd seen too much of war. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low and steady. She didn't understand the words, but she caught the tone. Calm, respectful. He pointed to himself. "Eddie," he said, then pointed to her son. "Good boy." Greta blinked, unsure what to say. Her voice cracked. "Danke," she whispered. He smiled at that. "Yeah, danke." She glanced at the chocolate bar still clutched in Hans's hands, and something inside her chest broke open, the smallest spark of trust in a world that had long forgotten the meaning of it. The American reached into his jacket again, pulled out another small packet, and held it toward her. It was a ration tin. Stew, maybe. She hesitated, torn between pride and desperation. But then Maria's thin cry echoed from the cellar below, and Greta's decision was made for her. She reached out and took it. It felt heavier than it should have, heavy with meaning. The soldier nodded once, then turned back to his campfire, pretending not to notice the tears running down her face as she clutched that small metal can, like it was salvation. For the first time in months, Greta Mueller didn't feel like prey hiding from predators. She felt like a human being again, and somehow, against every warning. So did the young American soldier who'd chosen compassion over caution. And as she carried that tin back into the cellar, Greta realized that this single act of kindness in the ruins of a broken world might be what survival really meant. Not endurance, not defiance, but simple, quiet humanity. That night, the war sounded different. The thunder of artillery had been replaced by the clatter of mess tins and the low hum of men talking around a fire. The smell of stew still hung in the air, drifting into the cellar where Greta sat with Hans and Maria, dividing the American ration tin into 3 equal portions. The food was thick and salty, something like beef stew mixed with beans. She'd tasted nothing that rich in months. Every spoonful made her want to cry. Maria licked the edge of her spoon clean, eyes half closed. Hans barely paused between bites. Greta waited until they were done before allowing herself a single mouthful. It was cold by then, but she didn't care. She caught her reflection in a cracked mirror leaning against the cellar wall. The woman staring back looked older than her 31 years. Cheekbones sharp, lips cracked, hair gone flat and dull. But her eyes, for the first time in a long while, they didn't look dead. The next morning, Hans was the first to hear the rumble of engines again. He scrambled to the window, his small face lighting up when he saw the American soldiers returning to the same spot. "Can I go, Mama?" Greta hesitated. Every instinct screamed no, but something in her heart, the same something that had pushed her out of the cellar yesterday, told her to let him. "Yes," she said finally, her voice soft, "but stay where I can see you." Hans darted out the door, clutching the empty tin as if it were treasure. Outside, Private Eddie Kowalski was pouring coffee from a battered pot when he saw the boy again. "Well, look who's back," he said to no one in particular. Corporal Flynn snorted. "You feeding the enemy again, Eddie?" Eddie didn't bother to answer. He just smiled at Hans and gestured toward the pot. "Coffee's too strong for you, kid, but I got something better." He reached into his pack and pulled out another Hershey's bar. The kid's eyes widened. Eddie broke it in half and handed him a piece. Hans hesitated, then said carefully, "Thank you." Eddie chuckled. "You're getting good at that." The sound of a small, cautious laugh startled him. He looked up to see Greta standing a few yards away, Maria tucked against her hip. She was watching them like someone watching a miracle, half believing, half terrified it would vanish. Eddie straightened. "Morning, ma'am," he said gently. Then, in slow, broken German, "Essen? Food?" Greta hesitated, eyes flicking toward the other soldier. One of them, Sergeant Martinez, nodded encouragingly. She approached slowly. Eddie motioned toward the fire, where a pot of thick stew was simmering. "For you, for kids," he said. Greta shook her head at first. "No, you need," Eddie smiled. "We got plenty. Sit." Her legs trembled as she lowered herself onto an overturned crate. Maria peered curiously at the soldiers, still clutching her doll. Flynn muttered something about regulation, but Martinez shot him a look. "Let it be," he said quietly. Eddie ladled a portion into a tin bowl and handed it over. Greta took it carefully, like it might disappear if she moved too fast. "Danke," she said softly. Eddie nodded. "Bitte." They ate in silence for a while. The crackle of the fire filled the gaps where words couldn't. Every now and then, one of the soldiers would sneak a glance at the little family, the thin German mother, her starving children, and shift awkwardly, realizing how young she was, how small they were. When they finished, Greta wiped Maria's chin with her sleeve, then looked at Eddie. "You good man," she said haltingly. He laughed. "My grandmother says that sometimes." "Not often." Her brow furrowed. "Grandmother?" Eddie tapped his chest. "Babcia," he said, using the Polish word, then pointed skyward. "Chicago. Far away." Greta nodded, understanding more than his words. "My husband, Russia," she said quietly. "Not come back." Eddie's expression softened. "I'm sorry." Greta shrugged slightly, that weary, defeated motion of someone who's out of tears. War, take all. There was no argument for that. As the day went on, the soldiers started finding excuses to come closer. Corporal Rodriguez offered Hans a canteen lid to use as a toy boat in a puddle. Johnson from Alabama drew pictures in the dust for Maria, rough stick figures of a girl with pigtails and a cat with a tail too long. The children giggled, small, shy sounds that made everyone pause. By evening, it felt less like a battlefield and more like a strange kind of family dinner that none of them would admit they needed. That night, Eddie wrote a letter by the light of the fire. "Dear Babcia," he began, "today I fed a German family, a woman and 2 kids. You told me once to feed hungry people no matter where they come from. I remembered that today. They looked just like us, tired and scared and starving. You'd say I did right, I think. I hope so." He stared at the letter for a long time before folding it carefully into his pocket. The next morning, Greta brought something to the fire, a small loaf of bread, flat and burned at the edges. It was barely food, but it was hers to give. "For you," she said, setting it beside the pot. Eddie blinked. "You don't have to." "I want," she interrupted, smiling faintly. It was the first real smile he'd seen from her. Hans tugged at his sleeve. "Eddie," he said proudly. "Look." He held up a small flower he'd found among the rubble, a scraggly purple thing that had somehow survived the bomb. Eddie took it carefully, like it was made of glass. "Beautiful," he said. "You keep that spirit, kid. It'll take you far." Flynn muttered from his seat. "You're getting sentimental, Kowalski." Eddie didn't deny it. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Yes, I am." That evening, a supply truck rumbled into camp carrying mail. One of the letters was addressed to Private Edward Kowalski, 29th Infantry Division. The envelope was covered in his grandmother's shaky handwriting. He opened it beside the fire. "My dear Eddie," she wrote, "I hear the war is ending soon. Remember what I told you when you were a boy. Feed hungry children before you feed yourself. That's how we keep our souls clean when the world gets dirty. Love, Babcia." Eddie folded the paper and smiled to himself. Sergeant Martinez noted. "Good news?" "Yeah," Eddie said softly. "Just a reminder of who I'm supposed to be." The next day, Greta surprised him again. She approached the fire and asked in hesitant English, "Your family, Polish?" He nodded. "Yes, Warsaw." Her eyes widened. "My neighbor, before war, Polish family, Name was Kowalich, Eddie blinked. The name hit like a jolt. Kowalich? He repeated. Yes, Greta said. They hide Jewish family. Help them! His throat tightened. My grandmother, she was one of them, hidden by a German family in Warsaw. She never knew their names. They looked at each other in stunned silence, two people realizing that fate had tied their families together long before the war brought them face to face. Hands broke the silence by tugging at Eddie's coat. Eddie? He said in careful English. Chocolate, Greta gasped. It was the first English word she'd ever heard her son speak. Eddie laughed and reached into his pack. You earned it, buddy. For the first time in months, Greta laughed too. A full, unguarded laugh that startled even herself. The sound spread through the camp like sunlight. Rodriguez smiled. Martinez chuckled. Even Flynn cracked a grin. And for one fleeting afternoon, surrounded by ruins, soldiers, and starving civilians, it felt like the war had paused, not in truce, but in understanding. That night, Eddie wrote again. Babsia, I met a woman who might have been part of the story you told me, maybe the family who hid you. If that's true, then I'm not just feeding strangers. I'm paying back a debt across generations. He looked up from the letter, eyes catching the flicker of the fire reflected in Greta's window. Some debts, he thought, are written not in ink, but in kindness. And as dawn crept over the ruins of Germany, the first fragile peace between former enemies began with a chocolate bar, a bowl of stew, and a grandmother's lesson that had survived the war. The days that followed felt like something out of a dream, the kind you try not to wake from. Spring sunlight filtered through the smoke that still clung to the town. The sound of gunfire had faded far off toward the east, replaced by hammering and the occasional rumble of distant trucks. The war wasn't exactly over, but it was slowing, like a fire burning through its last scraps of fuel. Every morning now, Hans would run to the cellar window the moment he heard the jeeps. He'd wave if he saw Eddie or Martinez. And sometimes, if the road was clear, Greta would let him cross the rubble-strewn street. The boy would come back with treasures, a can of peaches, a tin of stew, sometimes even a tiny wrapped chocolate. Greta hated accepting it. Every bite felt like both mercy and shame. But every time she tried to refuse, Eddie would shake his head and smile. My grandma would be mad if I didn't share, he'd say, half joking, half serious. The soldiers had set up camp in what used to be the town square, though there wasn't much square left. A burned-out fountain sat at the center, its marble figures half shattered by shell fire. The Americans had cleaned out a few buildings nearby, turning them into supply depots and makeshift barracks. Eddie had started using the old cafe as a sort of unofficial canteen. The sign above the door still read Konditorei Müller, letters chipped but legible. Sometimes Greta would stand outside and stare at it, realizing that just months ago, her children had walked past that same shop window on their way to school. Now it was filled with American uniforms and laughter that didn't sound like war. It was strange, comforting, and terrifying at the same time. How quickly the human heart could start to trust again. On the fifth day, Martinez brought news. The front had moved east. The fighting was shifting toward Czechoslovakia. The men didn't know what that meant for them, but they all sensed the war's end was coming. Flynn was the only one who didn't seem happy about it. Mark my words, he grumbled, cleaning his rifle. Soon as Berlin falls, the brass will find another fight. There's always another fight. Eddie ignored him. He was too busy showing Hans how to clean an old field compass. See this? He said, twisting the lid. Always points north. Means you never really get lost, even if you think you are. Hans squinted. Even in war? Eddie smiled faintly. Especially in war. It was a small moment, but Greta saw the look in her son's eyes. Curiosity. That spark she hadn't seen since before the bombings. The boy who had once stopped speaking altogether was now asking questions again, his voice soft but steady. Maria, meanwhile, had begun humming again, little bits of lullabies that Johann used to sing before he went off to the front. The sound startled Greta the first time she heard it. She'd almost forgotten what her daughter's voice sounded like, and then came the letter. It arrived in the evening mail run, another envelope marked from Chicago. Eddie read it aloud by the fire, translating bits for Martinez. My dear grandson, if you must carry a rifle, carry kindness too. Remember, the world does not heal itself through punishment, but through mercy. I survived because strangers fed me when they had nothing to spare. Feed others now, and the world might remember what humanity looks like. When Eddie looked up, Martinez was nodding slowly. She sounds like my mother, he said. Always said kindness is a rebellion in times like this. Eddie laughed. Guess that makes us rebels. That night, Greta joined them by the fire for the first time. The soldiers made room on the log without a word. Maria fell asleep in her lap while Hans leaned against Eddie's arm, carefully tracing the U.S. flag patch on his sleeve. You from America? Greta said quietly, testing her English. Yes? Eddie nodded. Detroit, Car City, she said, smiling a little. He grinned. Yeah, you know it? She pointed to the old fountain. My husband, Johann, mechanic, fix cars before war. Eddie stared into the fire. Then you'd get along. My dad fixes everything too. Says people are the hardest machines to repair. Greta gave a small laugh, the sound of someone who didn't remember how to. He right, she said. The next morning, the piece continued in tiny, fragile ways. Rodriguez taught Hans how to say good morning in English. Flynn, despite his complaints, slipped Maria a small wooden figure he'd carved from a piece of scrap wood. Don't tell anyone, he said gruffly, handing it over. Even the medic, Doc Patterson, began checking in on them, bandaging Hans's scraped knee and listening to Maria's lung. Kids are tough, he said to Greta in slow German. Strong hearts. For a moment, it felt like the war had finally taken a breath. Peace, Greta would later think, is always the briefest visitor. The first sign that it wouldn't last came the next Monday morning. A new Jeep rolled into camp, cleaner, newer, too polished for a frontline vehicle. The man who stepped out was young, maybe late 20s, but carried himself with the stiffness of someone who'd memorized every page of a rulebook. Lieutenant James Blake. Eddie saw him and felt his stomach sink. The clipboard in Blake's hand was always a bad sign. Attention! Martinez barked, and the men snapped to formation. Blake looked them over. The unshaven faces, the relaxed postures, the half-washed uniforms. He frowned slightly, then spoke in a clipped Georgia accent. Gentlemen, I've been sent here to restore proper discipline. Headquarters reports some irregularities in your conduct with local civilians. Flynn shot Eddie a glance. Blake continued. Effective immediately. There will be no fraternization with German civilian, no sharing of ration, no unofficial aid, no contact. The war is not yet over, and these people are still enemy nationals. Martinez tried to interject. Sir, with respect, these are women and kids. They're starving. Blake's gaze sharpened. And whose fault is that, Sergeant? The German army started this war. Don't confuse pity with duty. Eddie clenched his jaw. Through the window of the old cafe, he could see Greta standing by the fountain with Hans and Maria, waiting for the usual morning greeting. She was smiling faintly, holding a bundle of laundry she'd promised to wash for the soldiers in exchange for food. Blake followed Eddie's line of sight, and his voice hardened. Private Kowalski, you've been particularly noted for these breaches of protocol. Consider this your warning. Eddie didn't move. Sir, they're not soldiers. They're just trying to survive. Blake cut him off. They're Germans, Private. That's all that matters. As of tomorrow, you're reassigned to convoy duty. You leave at 0600 hours. Dismissed. Eddie stood there for a moment, fists tightening at his sides. Martinez gave him a look that said everything words couldn't. He packed his duffel in silence that night. From across the square, Greta saw the movement through her window, the folding of uniforms, the stuffing of letters, the careful wrapping of a single chocolate bar. Her stomach sank. When Eddie finally came to say goodbye, she was waiting in the cellar doorway. Her eyes were colder than he'd ever seen them. You leave, she said quietly. Like all soldiers, he opened his mouth. Greta, I don't want to... Want not matter, she interrupted. Orders matter. We understand orders. Her English had improved, but her tone was flat. The same voice she'd used when speaking to Nazi officers months ago. The same wall she'd finally started to lower was back up. She turned and disappeared into the cellar, closing the door with a quiet finality that hit harder than any shouted goodbye. Eddie stood there, the air cold and heavy around him. In his hand, he still held the last chocolate bar. He left it by the door before walking away. The next morning, the convoy rolled out. From the back of the truck, Eddie looked toward the ruins of the town one last time. In the cellar window, Hans was standing perfectly still, the silver candy wrapper glinting in his hand like a tiny flag. He didn't wave. He just watched as the trucks disappeared over the hill, learning in that moment what millions of children had already learned in this war, that even kindness could vanish, and that promises were as fragile as paper in the wind. 3 weeks passed. The war was ending everywhere except inside Greta's heart. No one had told her officially, but she could feel it in the air, in the way the distant artillery had stopped, in the way soldiers' voices carried farther through the streets. Germany was collapsing, but what replaced it felt like emptiness. The cellars smelled of damp earth and old fear. Hans hadn't spoken since the convoy left. He just sat in the corner, clutching the empty chocolate wrapper that had once meant hope. He would unfold it, stare at the faint print of English letters, then fold it again, as if the ritual could bring Eddie back. Maria slept most of the time now. The little girl who once sang to herself was too weak to hum. Greta could count her ribs through the thin fabric of her dress. Each breath felt like a countdown. She'd promised herself she wouldn't cry. Not in front of them. Not again. But every night, when both children were asleep, she would press her face into the dirt floor and sob quietly. The kind of sobbing that came from too many years of loss. The silence was worse than the bombs. By the third week, Greta made her decision. They couldn't keep hiding in that cellar. The war might be ending, but starvation didn't care about peace treaties. The Americans had taken control of the region, and maybe if she surrendered herself, they would at least feed her children before sending them to a camp. She didn't think about pride anymore. Pride was for people who still had choices, so she woke Hans and Maria before dawn. The sky was gray, thin mist curling through the broken streets. She dressed them in their cleanest clothes, a patched blue coat for Maria, a faded wool sweater for Hans. Then she braided her daughter's hair with slow, trembling fingers. Hans didn't ask questions. That scared her more than anything. An 8-year-old who didn't ask why was a child who'd learned the wrong lessons from the world. They walked through the ruins in silence. Every window looked like an empty eye socket. Every burned-out house smelled faintly of old smoke and rot. Greta's shoes slipped on the rubble, but she didn't stop. She rehearsed her English in her head, words she'd practiced for weeks. I am German civilian. I need help. I have 2 children. We work for food. The checkpoint was just ahead, marked by 2 American flags and a few sandbags. She could already see the soldiers moving about. Helmets, rifles, the flash of sunlight off metal. Her throat tightened. She wanted to turn back, but Maria stumbled, and that tiny motion decided everything. Greta steadied her daughter and whispered, "Just a little farther." Then, a voice called out, "Mrs. Muller?" She froze. The sound of that name, in that accent, it couldn't be. She turned, and for a heartbeat, she thought her mind was playing tricks on her. 20 feet away, carrying a duffel bag and looking like he hadn't slept in days, stood Eddie Kowalski. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Hans whispered, "Eddie." It was the first word he'd spoken in days. Small, shaky, but alive. Eddie dropped his bag and crossed the distance in a few strides, kneeling down just like the first time. His uniform was different now, a little dirtier, a little less polished, but his eyes were the same, kind. "Hey, buddy," he said softly. "Heard you might need some help." Hans blinked at him, almost afraid to believe it. "You came back," Eddie smiled. "I told you I'd bring something next time, didn't I?" He reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope, thin and carefully folded. "It's from my grandmother. She told me to read it to you." He opened it gently, the paper trembling slightly in his hand. His voice was steady but low, carrying across the quiet checkpoint where other soldiers had begun to gather. "My dear grandson," he read, translating as he went. "If ever you find yourself in a place where the world has forgotten how to be kind, you must remember for it. Feed them like I would feed you. Feed them like the German family fed me when I was hiding from those who wanted to hurt me. Children first. Always children first. That is how we stay human." When he finished, no one spoke. Even the soldiers nearby had fallen silent. The only sound was the soft rustle of wind through broken shutters. Greta's throat ached. She couldn't find words. Not in German, not in English. Martinez stepped forward from the small crowd of soldiers, his expression solemn. "Regulations are one thing," he said quietly, "but a grandmother's wisdom, that's something else." A murmur ran through the group. Private Johnson, the young man from Alabama, pulled a chocolate bar from his pocket and held it out toward Han. Then Corporal Rodriguez followed, offering a can of peaches. Even men Greta had never seen before stepped forward with small gifts. A piece of bread, a cigarette, a tin cup of coffee. Blake wasn't among them yet, but Greta could feel the tension in the air, the unspoken question of whether he'd appear and shut it all down again. Eddie stood up slowly, his voice carrying across the checkpoint now. "We can't undo what's been done," he said. "Can't bring back the people we lost, but maybe we can decide what kind of people we are from now on. We can follow orders, or we can remember we're still human." For a second, Greta thought he'd said too much, that any moment now, Blake would emerge and punish them all. And then he did appear, clipboard gone, cap slightly askew, looking strangely smaller without his authority armor. He stopped beside Eddie, scanning the scene. The German mother, the two hungry children, the American soldiers offering food. His jaw tightened, but his eyes softened when they landed on Hans. The boy stood there holding the chocolate bar Private Johnson had given him, his small fingers still clutching the old empty wrapper from weeks before. Something shifted in Blake's face. A flicker of memory, maybe, or guilt. He spoke quietly, almost to himself. "Sergeant Martinez," he said after a pause, "I believe we have some surplus rations that need distributing. Humanitarian purposes." Martinez nodded. "Yes, sir." The soldiers moved instantly, not like men following order, but like people remembering how to breathe. They unpacked boxes, shared supplies, offered hands instead of weapons. Greta felt her knees weaken. The relief was almost too much. She turned toward Eddie. "You come back," she said softly. He smiled faintly. "Had to. My grandma wouldn't let me rest if I didn't." For a moment, they just stood there. The German mother who'd burned her Nazi card, the Polish-American soldier whose family had once been hidden by Germans, two people from opposite sides of a war that had tried to erase their humanity, now standing together because of a letter written in shaky Polish script. Hans opened his new chocolate bar and carefully tore it in half. He handed one piece to Maria, then looked up at Eddie with shy determination. "Share," he said in careful English. Eddie blinked hard, trying not to let it show. "That's right, kid," he said, voice cracking. "We share." The moment didn't feel like history. It felt ordinary. Muddy boots, soft wind, the smell of stew heating over a field stove. But Greta would remember it for the rest of her life, because in that simple act, her children learned that kindness could survive anything, even war. Later that evening, when the sky turned the color of ash and rose, Greta sat by the fire with her children, watching them eat their first real meal in months. Eddie sat beside them, telling stories about Detroit and his grandmother's garden, about how things would grow again after winter, if you just kept planting. For the first time in years, Greta allowed herself to imagine tomorrow. Not the next hour, not the next day, but an actual tomorrow, where her children could sleep without fear. When the stars came out, Maria fell asleep with a piece of chocolate still clutched in her hand, and Greta looked at the soldiers around her, Americans, Mexicans, Poles, sons of immigrants and farmers, and realized something she would tell her grandchildren decades later, that the surprise wasn't that American soldiers gave food to German children. The surprise was that, even after everything, human beings still could.